This panel is called Seizing the Moment, and we're here to sort of talk about the particular moment that we're in and why it matters. So I will actually have each panelist introduce him or herself, tell you a little bit about what they do, and then comment on your view as to what this moment is and what's at stake. Starting with Paul.
My name is Paul Wright. I'm the Executive Director and the founder of the Human Rights Defense Center. We're based in Lake Worth, Florida, with offices in Nashville and Seattle as well. We publish Prison Legal News, which for those that are here, there's a copy of the magazine in your folder. And we report on criminal justice issues, everything from the front end of policing to conditions of confinement, what's going on in prisons and jails, and the back end of parole, probation, reentry, and things like that. In addition to publishing the magazine, we also publish and distribute books dealing with primarily self-help topics and legal research and things like that for people in prison. And we also do advocacy, and we also do litigation, primarily around First Amendment issues, public records. And in 2011, we founded the Prison Phone Justice Campaign to seek to get the Federal Communications Commission to end the financial exploitation and gouging of prisoners and their families on prison phone calls. And earlier this year, we founded another project, Stop Prison Profiteering, with the overall goal of ending the financial exploitation of prisoners and their families. We don't think that the police state should be funded on the backs of the poorest people in America. If the government wants to have a police state, everyone needs to pay for it equally.
So tell us about the moment we're in and what's at stake.
As far as the moment goes, I think that our real moment was in 2008 with the financial crisis then, and that moment came and went, and the only one who stepped up to the plate was President Obama, who responded by sending billions of dollars to prisons, jails, and police departments around the country. I think as far as our current moment, we're seeing a lot of rhetoric and talk, but we aren't really seeing anything actually happen. And I say this from the perspective of someone, I've been doing this for 25 years now. In the 1990s, I watched the tide of repression come in. And we had a lot of rhetoric then. And we also had hundreds of bills across state legislatures in Congress. We had hundreds of bills, hundreds of laws being passed and enacted every year. It took us 200 years to lock up 1 million people. It took us less than 15 to lock up the next million. And no one is talking about dismantling those laws and that infrastructure that created the modern American police state. No one is talking about repealing the federal crime bill of 1994 or every other federal crime bill that's been passed every other year for the past 30 years. No one is talking about repealing 3 strikes or mandatory minimums. So until we actually start seeing concrete action, I think, and you know, our legislators, they know how to do things. They have a very good track record of passing tough on crime and anti-prisoner bills and such. And we're not actually seeing anything to roll back everything that they did in the past 25 years that got us to where we're at. So I think until we actually see some concrete action on that, rhetoric remains rhetoric until it's accompanied by action.
Off to a good start. Charlene, Charlene, introduce yourself.
He's scared me.
Yeah.
So I'm Charlene Sinclair. I'm the director for the Center for Race, Religion, and Economic Democracy. Thank you all for having me. This is I'm always excited when I'm able to have a conversation and expand my conversation partners and meet fellow justice nerds. So I'm here. So the Center for Race, Religion, and Economic Democracy is now about 1.5 years old. And we created the center specifically because although all of us were very grounded in the methodology of community organizing, we recognized that most of community organizing looked at power from 3 levels. You know, coercion and force, or organized money, or organized people. And much of the work that we do did not deal with that 4th level, which is organized ideas, hegemony, counter-narratives, narratives, etc. And so we wanted to be able to intervene at that level and recognize that both race and religion were key ideological tools that rarely gets addressed, rarely gets moved, rarely gets organized to move our issues forward. So we entered into that space with the idea that not only would we look at these tools in terms of how do we react against them, but to begin to start organizing people to think strategically and intentionally about how to utilize them to shape a consent that will actually create a fertile ground for us to move some more progressive policy. And in terms of the moment that we're in, part of what the moment we're in, I think, is the need for us to actually shift the moral panic meter. Much of what we are doing actually is based on a moral panic that says when you see black and brown bodies, then you see violence, you see crime, you see trouble, you see everything that we need to fight against and contain. The question is, can we move moral panic in the other direction so that when we see poverty, we panic? When we see young children without parents, we panic. When we see men being disappeared from their communities, we panic. So that's the big, I think this is the moment that we're in. We're in a moment when we have the ability now, because of the heightened awareness of where we are as a country around this level of containment and disappearance, for us to begin to start shifting. And the question for us becomes, how do we do that? Do we do that so that we reinforce the notion that containment is fine, it's just a matter of what level? Or do we do that in such a way that we begin to start actually calling into question what are the things that we truly need to be concerned about? And how do we truly address on the front end, as well as the middle and the tail end, the problems that actually move communities directly into not just poverty, but an end result that can't be anything other than incarceration. And one last thing I would say, based on Nick's comments around the level of disappearedness of men and increasingly women in communities, what does that do for the shape of what communities look like? As Bruce Western tells us, increasingly young men are being shaped by the prison systems, not by jobs, not by schools, not by families, not by churches. What does it look like in a community when the only experience that young people have in their most formative years is that of incarceration? What does that do for the kind of country we are developing? That's the moment we're in.
Marc, tell us about your work and what's at stake in this moment.
Great, well, thank you. We started the Center for Effective Justice when I came on board with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the free market think tank in Texas, in 2005. And at that point, I think I was virtually the only person on the right in the country working on these issues. And I'm happy to say we had a lot of success in Texas, not just because of us, but also the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, Texas Appleseed, the ACLU, other groups we work with. And of course, we've closed 3 adult prisons, 8 juvenile lockups. As you probably heard, we have a lot more work to do, which we're working on right now in our legislative session. But it really did lead to other states asking us about what we were doing, legislators in other states, and then that basically caused me to say in 2010 we need to launch something called Wright on Crime. And I'm sure you all have probably seen it, when what we've been able to do is take some of our national signatories to the statement of principles that we have for Wright on Crime, people like Ken Cuccinelli, Newt Gingrich, and so forth, to go out and speak, do op-eds, really talk to policymakers around the country about the need to be smarter on this issue. And I think that we've seen, I mean, you look, Georgia's black incarceration is down 20% as a result of 3 straight sessions of pretty landmark reforms there. So there is a moment that we're in, and I'm sure y'all are familiar with many of the bills pending at the federal level. And I think that I would agree certainly that the economic crisis in 2008 helped bring this about, but I will say that there's more to this than just saving money, and I think that was alluded to in the opening remarks, that we need to look at this as a way to get people back to being productive, to keep families together, to recognize the value of redemption that's in virtually every major religious tradition. So I think there's probably some skepticism in some quarters that conservatives are just interested in saving money, but I will tell you that really at the end of the day, I think what we're all interested in is people being able to live up to their potential, people be able to pursue their dreams, to be able to provide for their family. And so I think that first of all, of course, we need to continue safely reducing incarceration, and that's a great thing. Over the last 5 years, the states that have cut incarceration have had crime go down more than those that haven't. So we have a track record to build on. And I will acknowledge that, you know, policymakers are still skittish in a lot of places on these issues, and so it's going to take longer to unwind this than it did to wind it up, probably. But I think the way you do it is you take the steps gradually, and you see that these legislators, governors who voted for these things, like Nathan Deal, John Kasich, and so forth, rather than being an albatross in their elections, they're running on it. So we don't care which party gets the credit or who gets the credit, as long as it gets done. So we're really excited, I think, to to be on the verge of what could be breakthroughs, certainly at the federal level, and continued successes in states around the country.
So John, the insider, tell us about your work and tell us who you are and how you see this moment and what's at stake.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks for the invite. My name's John Wetzel. I'm the Secretary of Corrections for the state of Pennsylvania. And 4 years ago, I inherited a system that was growing by 1,500 inmates a year over a 24-year period under 2 Democrat governors and 1 Republican governor. 4 years later, we have less inmates, less prison, lower crime in Pennsylvania, and lower recidivism. Last year, we had 1,000 less individuals either rearrested or reincarcerated after they got out. So when you talk about point in time, it's such a crazy moment in criminal justice when the conservative and the corrections guy are the optimists on a panel talking about corrections reform. You know it's one of those moments, and that's where we're at. And I think probably for me the coolest part is that we're not, we don't have to say anymore that this is not a partisan issue. We don't have to say that anymore. We still do, but we don't have to. And the reality is, I don't believe anyone would make the argument that we do a great job with criminal justice or corrections policy. And I don't believe anyone would argue that we have to change. And I think you can look at a lot of states who are having big impacts on population, on outcomes, on crime by getting smarter. And by smarter, I mean just using incarceration more precisely. By the same token, what we need to do is not do how we got here, which is make quick, rash decisions that sound good and are great sound bites, but don't accomplish much of anything. And we won't know what we accomplished, what it accomplished, because we don't put measurements up front. We don't base it on research. So as we unscrew this, however you described it, maybe you didn't say unscrew, but I would say unscrew this system and really get to a place where we're getting what we want. And we can all agree that when someone becomes criminally involved, what we want is when they get out of the back end of the system, they're less likely to commit another crime in the first place. I mean, it's really just that simple. So I think that we need to do it in the right manner, and that's having everybody at the table, people who are impacted, people who are operating. And when we come up with solutions, do it in a manner that we can operationalize it. Stuff sounds great at panels like this, and you go back inside and try to affect these policies, and we often struggle with operationalizing. But we do have an opportunity, and we can look to the states across the country, red states and blue states and purple states and whatever other colors you want to throw out there, having good success in getting more precise in our criminal justice, and ultimately the path to precision is also the path to lower crime and better lives for individuals who are involved in the system.
Thank you. And I'm Fred Patrick, Director of the Center on Sentencing and Corrections at the Vera Institute of Justice, and pleased to moderate this panel. So even though there's lots of talk about the potential for criminal justice reform, it seems as though most of the coalescence have been around fairly minor goals of providing employment and removing barriers for employment to folks coming home, keeping nonviolent folks out of the system, and then reducing in some vague way the overall imprisonment rate. What's missing from that agenda? John, let's go back this way.
Well, first of all, I don't know if that's modest when you look at where we're at, right? So I know sometimes we compare to the ideal to what we're doing and say that's modest. If you compare what we're doing now to what we're doing 10 years ago, I don't think you can define that as modest. But you know, the focus, as someone referred to earlier, really needs to start at the front end. So you talk about corrections reform. Corrections reform is community reform, right? So we need to get in a place where folks who make policies have the guts to make decisions that don't save money today, but result in cost avoidance years from now by giving folks, especially young folks, especially kids in our most disadvantaged communities, an opportunity to be successful, an opportunity to have hope. And that requires a focus at that level. And at the same time, when we're bolstering infrastructures in those communities, folks are coming back out into those communities. So that does pay off in a bunch of different ways. But we really need to make sure that we never have a conversation about corrections reform without talking about educational opportunities and economic opportunities in the most disadvantaged communities, because it's all the same ball of wax.
Charlene?
I would actually agree wholeheartedly with that. And one of the things that I think we should begin to start thinking about is even how we look at reentry. Because reentry tends to be framed as a social service piece of work. You know, you do job readiness and job training, et cetera. What if we begin to look at reentry as a job creation mechanism? You know, Paul talked about 2008. Well, we had an opportunity, and we still have an opportunity then, to actually invest in infrastructure, invest in jobs, to create a broader work program to move people in. But we don't put resources towards job creation. And for many communities, as you had said, the opportunities don't exist. And to think that you can have impoverished communities with little opportunities, minimum to no wage, little skill, no skill, and then we won't have people that actually create mechanisms for underground employment or black market employment, or you know that trauma won't lead them to actually self-medicate or over-medicate, or to think that we can actually stem what is happening in communities if we're not investing economically, I think is a farce. I mean, we need to understand that we have to put the resources up front for community development in order for us to even begin to think that we'll be able to crack this nut, or else we will be tinkering. Even if we're doing big tinkering, it will still ultimately be tinkering.
Marc, you nodded your head a few times.
For sure. I mean, I think that, as you said, I mean, the things like talking about nonviolent offenders, over half the people coming in are nonviolent offenders. So just even a focus on that can substantially reduce the prison population. And of course, California got a lot of publicity with Prop 47, which I think, you know, sensibly reduced low-level drug possession to a misdemeanor from a felony, which, you know, has a lot of virtues in terms of, you know, universally leading to less incarceration. But what was interesting is a couple months ago, Utah did the same thing by legislation. It was actually part of a comprehensive package that substantially increased investment in treatment and diversion. In Utah, obviously conservative state, and it wasn't through a ballot measure. So, you know, and I think the other thing is we're also obviously focusing on things like solitary confinement. And it's, you know, it does cost more than general population, but that's not why we got into it. We looked at the fact that, for example, people are being released directly from solitary confinement to the public. Almost 1,000 people every year in Texas alone. And it's a ridiculous policy. And there's sound research showing, of course, that they're far more likely to recidivate. But beyond that, also just, you know, it's inhumane to keep people in if they're not a danger to another inmate. Certainly there are cases where someone assaults a staff member or whatever, but too often people are going into and languishing in solitary confinement because they're simply a suspected gang member or because of relatively minor disciplinary violations that could be dealt with through other sanctions. So we still, as we work to reduce incarceration, I agree, I think we all do, that we need to also continue to make sure for those who are incarcerated that there's programming that's effective, that the conditions are not so bad that they interfere with that programming, and that we're smarter about things like solitary confinement. And, you know, people with mental illness, that's another area that we need to continue focusing on. And we found there's tremendous public support. I mean, most people know someone who's either had an addiction or a mental health issue, whether it's in their family or their friend. So we can leverage that, not to mention the issue that 65 million Americans have a criminal record. So if you combine those two, most people know someone who falls into one of those categories. And so we need to broaden the kind of constituency across the country for criminal justice reform. So it's an issue just like taxes and healthcare and education that people think about, you know, as a kitchen table matter.
Paul, are we being ambitious enough?
No, actually, I'm kind of stunned by the lack of ambition and lack of vision, because I think that, and I think that's one of the things that characterizes, you know, what passes for debate in American politics. One of the things that's been totally missing from this discussion so far is what about conditions of confinement? We've got 2.5 million people locked up in cages in this country on any given day. And no one's talking about improving transparency. These are the least transparent of American institutions. I know there's a number of journalists here in the room. And as a practical matter, none of us can go into most prison systems and physically interview a prisoner. Trying to get public records or accountability out of correctional institutions is well nigh impossible. And there's no oversight as a practical matter. So, you know, we're not talking about that. And I think one of the things is how we're framing reentry. And, kudos to Marc that he's at least raising the issue of solitary confinement. But I think if you start looking at the issue of reentry, you need to be thinking about that from the moment someone enters the prison facility. And if we know that 40 to 80% of people in prison are functionally illiterate, we can look at the fact that every legislature of this country, starting with President Clinton and this Congress, when they eliminated Pell Grants, they eliminated all higher education in this country. And when you think about it, when you start thinking in terms of broader policy issues, how many tens or hundreds of billions of dollars a year do we spend in this country teaching people to read and write? And then you have a population that is functionally illiterate, so you deprive them of all means of education. And some of the work that we do at HRDC is, we challenge prisons and jails that ban all books and magazines as well. I mean, this is happening on a daily basis. So, and then we've got the education thing, and we saw it when Governor Cuomo tried to put $5 million in the budget in New York to modestly reinstate higher education in New York. He went into a brick wall of resistance and dropped it. Then we start getting into the issue of mental health treatment. If 40 to 60% of the prison population is mentally ill, it needs mental health treatment, and they're not getting it, what does that tell us about our priorities? And this whole thing is that the conditions of confinement, and no one is talking that even if the magic wand is waved and American incarceration levels drop to where they were in 1990, from 2.5 million to 1 million, we've still got 1 million people behind bars. Statistically, they're still going to be largely functionally illiterate, high numbers of drug addiction, high numbers of mental illness, and then nothing's being done in terms of providing either mental health treatment, medical care, education, or anything like that. So then it's kind of like, why, if you don't give any of these people the resources or the abilities to help themselves, why is anyone surprised when there's high recidivism rates? The only miracle that I see is that recidivism rates are as low as they are in that context in terms of where the resources are going. The other thing that I think is missing from the context is when we talk about jobs and stuff like that, we're ignoring the fact that in this country for the past 25 or 30 years, prison construction, jail construction is a vast jobs program. You've got over 1 million people a year drawing a paycheck from caging other people. So when we're talking about reducing prison populations, and you go to places in upstate New York or Illinois or whatever, where the only job is the prison, this is one of the pushback factors that anyone is going to come up with if you're an elected politician. We've seen that in New York and a couple other places where governors have tried to close prisons and that, and they have basically the people working in the facilities are protesting because this is a good middle class job for them. So that's one of the other things that's been kind of largely ignored.
John, two things as a sort of sitting correctional administration. Talk about the accountability issues that were raised in terms of, so the ability of sort of Joe and Jane citizen to understand so what's happening and the human dignity aspect of how we're incarcerated. And also, have you run into this prisons as an economic engine, economic development?
Absolutely. I mean, listen, there's no argument around that. I mean, there's a lot of people employed by the field, but even in spite of that, there's prisons closing all over the place at the state level. So it's certainly a challenge, but it's not an insurmountable challenge and at all. As far as the accountability, I think if you look at the field of corrections 10 years ago versus today, we've come eons as it relates to even having public discussion saying, yes, we've overused segregation. Okay, you got us. And we're going to figure out how to reduce the use of it. I mean, we worked with, had Vera Institute in, who's kind of a group who's going around the country really doing assessments of the use of segregation as it relates to versus the actual offenses that are resulting in segregation and specialty populations. I think there's a tremendous amount, especially compared to 10 years ago. It's relative. I mean, it's not a school. It's not a place where anybody can just walk in off the, I guess you can't even walk in off the street into a school anymore, so let me not use that as an example. But it's certainly not a place that people can just walk in. We've certainly made some considerable progress as it relates to transparency, but there's more to go. I mean, I don't disagree at all that if you're going to invest in Pennsylvania $2.3 billion in the state prison system, that doesn't include counties, you should know how the heck you're spending your money or how we're spending your money. So I agree with the notion that part of the answer is to get more transparent. But I also think one of the things that you hit on, sir, that really we need to be cognizant of is this is a choice. This is a choice by the public as a whole. I mean, this system it's not them, it's us, you know. And so be very clear that when we talk, oftentimes I think one of the big challenges we're going to have as we continue to reduce population, is that we're going to want to reduce spend equally. So we're not going to want to ensure that we have appropriate conditions of confinement. I can tell you in Pennsylvania, up until we switched the GED testing to computer, we were graduating 1,100 inmates a year with their GED. We took a little step back, switching to the computer, but we'll get back up there. So there are educational opportunities outside of higher education, which has been a challenge. But even that challenge in New York and Pennsylvania, there's college classes going on, some funded by grants, some by the colleges who are just choosing to get here. So I don't disagree with any of the barriers that the gentleman points out. I disagree that they're insurmountable, because they're not. And that progress, while it may look slow, if we're heading this way instead of that way, we're heading in the right direction. And we need to keep heading, and we need to do it in a manner, to Marc's point, where we're engaging the public, where the public cares and understands the implications. And it's real simple to me. We're going to release 18 to 20,000 people from state prison. Chances that one of them are going to run into one of my 4 daughters is pretty damn good. So we should all be invested in our ability to correct or create an environment where someone can be corrected.
Marc, how do we move the needle? What do we need to do to get the public and others and other stakeholders moving and stop talking about it, but doing something?
Well, you know, I think it's, we've come a long way. I think that part of it is making sure people understand. It seems like there's always a dichotomy, a false dichotomy between, you know, individual accountability for crimes and people just saying, oh, okay, well, you know, this was because of how you brought up, we're not going to hold you accountable. And we're kind of filling in that spectrum because, of course, it's virtually always a mix of the two. And so, you know, for example, we've seen a lot of legislation in Texas that's going forward this year and other states dealing with prostitution, that recognizing that most of these individuals are victims of human trafficking and being able to get it off their record and so forth. And so certainly, as I say, issues of addiction and mental illness have to factor into culpability. And so, because the main reason, I believe, there's a lot of reasons, but perhaps the overriding reason we got to the system we have today is just a general punitive impulse. And so you could almost think about sentencing in separate buckets and say, how much of a sentence do we need for incapacitation? That is, that person is so dangerous that they need to be segregated from society, versus how much do we need for a punishment for the sake of punishment. And I think on that second score, the public is really coming our way, especially in terms of things like drugs and even, you know, minor property offenses, that people realize a lot of those are, of course, stealing money to get drugs to support an addiction. So people are recognizing that, okay, do I want to get results or do I want to get even with someone, right? And so the other thing, by the way, is certainly we can make a strong case that a lot of these alternatives to prison do, in fact, of course, require someone to hold a job, pay restitution, pay child support, that it's actually, we hear the phrase sometimes 3 hots on a cot. Not to say prisons are pleasant, certainly they're very unpleasant in Texas, they're not even air conditioned. But yet we have in Texas a lot of people choosing to go to state jail for 8 months instead of spending several years on probation. And part of it is they feel like they're going to be revoked anyway. And I think that was alluded to earlier. We've got to, at the same time we reduce incarceration, we also have to improve our probation system and these other alternatives so they're not just gotcha, but they're actually helping people succeed. You know, there was a sign in a California parole office a couple decades ago, but it said trail them, nail them, and jail them. And so in Texas and a lot of other states, we've actually been, the leaders of our parole division have been kind of trying to create a different culture where parole officers see their goal as helping these individuals succeed. You know, I'm always interested in the fact that if you Google teacher quality, you find a ton of things, but if you Google parole officer or probation officer quality, you get nothing. I mean, and if you do things like motivational interviewing, evidence-based practices, we know these much higher rates of success on probation and parole. And half the people going to prisons in this country country are revocations. Half of those are technical revocations, not even new crimes. And so I think we need to stop revoking people to prison for testing positive for marijuana and missing an appointment, and use, graduated sanctions as well as positive incentives. This session in Texas, a number of other states, is part of the federal earned time legislation from Cornyn to White House, but expanding earned time so people can earn time, whether they're on probation or in prison, by completing programs. And it's kind of like the real world. Your results are in life are a large part based on your own behavior, whereas in the correction system, historically, we've had this addiction to measuring everything by time. How long is somebody in a program or incarcerated, rather than are they actually getting better? So we need to shift to that kind of performance-based model.
Paul, how do we move the needle and get past the low-hanging fruit?
Well, I think part of things is one of the things that history has shown is that if you have the political will, anything is possible. And I think in this country we've had a lot of progress. I think on a lot of things. I think one of the things I take a lot of cheer from and that encourages me to be optimistic is I look at the progress that's been made around gay rights. And I was born in 1965, and in 1965 being gay was a psychiatric disorder, it was a criminal offense in most states, and today, almost 50 years later, there's been a huge amount of progress made around that. So I think that that illustrates that yes, change is possible and it can be done. But the big thing that I think we see is a lack of, so far I think has been a lack of political will on this, I think specifically from the executive and the legislative branches around the country, is that no one's really willing to invest political capital in this issue. Historically, the biggest vehicle, the primary vehicle for criminal justice reform in this country has been litigation. And Congress said what they had to say about that when they enacted the Prison Litigation Reform Act in 1996 to basically strip the federal courts of their ability to do anything about prison conditions or most criminal justice reform issues. So I think until we get to the point where we have broad consensus, and I think one of the things that I hear, I'm in Florida and I come up to DC on a regular basis, and one of the things I hear from my colleagues when I come here to DC is that on criminal justice reform issues, you need to have near unanimous passage to do anything on Capitol Hill here. That this isn't like healthcare or something like that where you can squeak by with a 2-vote margin in one of the houses. And I think that's one of the things. As someone who watched all the anti-prisoner, all the criminalization bills, sail through. In most parts of the country, this stuff passes through unanimously. I mean, there's more dissent in the Supreme Soviet under Brezhnev than there is in American legislatures these days on criminal justice things. There literally is no dissent, and I think that's one of the things that we've got a real problem with is the political culture in this country. The other thing that we've got too is how crime is defined. And everyone in this meeting today has been doing it too. We're just talking about crime in the streets, and no one's thinking about crime in the suites. I read in the newspaper yesterday, 5 banks plead guilty to manipulating currency exchange rates, and they're paying a $5 billion fine. But no one's going to prison. And I think that's one of the things that I think has made criminal justice reform in this country so resistant to change is the fact that we have a 2-tier system of criminal justice, one for rich people and one for poor people. And this panel and everyone else were talking about, Johnny has a substance addiction problem, he's going to prison and everything else. What can we do to get him out of there? But no one's talking about the bank president that's looting his bank, imploding our economies, and if those people were going to prison and were being subjected to the prison conditions that everyone else is being subjected to, there would be a very different conversation about the need and the urgency for criminal justice reform in this country, and we're not seeing that. So I think that's one of the things that really impacts that. The good thing about mass incarceration, though, is that it's impacting more and more people. I do a fair amount of public speaking in most of the places I go to. 10 years ago when I'd ask someone, do you know someone that's been in prison or is in prison, and depending on the audience, how upscale they were, a certain number of hands would go up. These days, even with upscale audiences, around 3/4 of the hands are going up. So I think the plus side of mass incarceration is it's affecting more people. And I think, like Marc says, this is becoming more of a kitchen table discussion.
Well, yeah, I mean, the only thing I would counter a little bit on that is that, I mean, I think some of the issues that actually affect certain economic crimes are actually similar to those that affect drug crimes, and I'll give you an example. One of the issues we work on a lot is the issue of criminal intent, or mens rea. So we filed an amicus brief, for example, in the 11th Circuit on a case where basically Florida, in their drug laws, said you don't have to have any level of intent to commit a crime. So if you rented a car at Hertz and you didn't know there were drugs where the spare tire was, that case of a trunk, was the last person had them there, and you were pulled over for speeding and dog sniffs that, you're done. I mean, it doesn't matter that you weren't negligent, you didn't know about it. And so, but the same token, we've seen people going into federal prison for importing orchids without filing the right paperwork, importing seafood from Central America. It led to an 8-year federal prison term. And so there's a real issue, especially with now, there's over 4,500 federal criminal laws. In Texas, we have over 1,500. So there is an issue of people simply not knowing that certain things are illegal, that are these non-traditional crimes. Now, certainly people that commit fraud, a Bernie Madoff, whatever, yes, they need to be in prison. But there are some of these economic, and it may be bad judgment, or it might have been somebody should have, you can't always say just because somebody lost money in a venture or somebody didn't fill out the right paperwork or whatever it is, that it's necessarily fraud. There's a certain state of mind that traditionally in Western law, it has to be a guilty mind plus a bad act equals a crime. So I think we need to make sure we hold to that. It's also come up, by the way, in zero tolerance, because you have kids who bring an asthma inhaler to school and forgot to register it with the school office, and they end up getting suspended, expelled, sent into the juvenile justice system. So we've been working to try to roll back these zero tolerance laws as well.
Charlene?
There are a couple of things that I want to comment on. One is that I continue to hear a conversation around consent and how people feel and what people believe, and yet we do very little to actually shape that. We do very little to roll back the consent we've built up over decades. We didn't arrive here simply because policy came out of the blue. We arrived here because we created these policies. And we created these policies because we also created a sense of fear. And we also created the sense that crime was running out of control. And we created the political will to create these bad policies. So in order for us to scale it back, we don't only need good policy, we need to create a different political will. And so we need to begin to start thinking about what are the ways in which we create the political will. How do we begin to start investing seriously in strategic communications, grassroots community organizing? How do we begin to start engaging in hearing the voices of the people that are affected, so that we don't think it's just human culpability, but we recognize that this is also a problem of, I think it was Ruth Wilson Gilmore that says statecrafting. It's a problem that we created because instead of doing the hard work and putting the resources into investing deeply in communities, we've actually not invested in communities. We've not invested in people, and we've not invested in infrastructure, and yet we wonder why these communities implode. They implode because we have done nothing with them. Anything you leave to rot will rot. That's just the nature of it. And so I think that in addition to great policy, in addition to being able to have, good public officials, we have to actually have everyday real people say enough is enough. And that's not going to happen in a vacuum. We're going to have to put the time in to do the work, to create the kind of conversation that moves outside of these walls. Because for the most part, many of us talk to each other. And even when my mother watches Law and Order almost every day. Do you think she likes what I do? Because for her, Law and Order is what criminal justice looks like. And part of the reason why we've been able to see this shift in the LGBTQ movement is because we've seen a different understanding of what it means for same gender loving people to be together. That took time. That took Modern Family. It didn't just happen. And so we really need to be thinking about how do we at multiple levels create a political will. Because without us doing it on the ground, moving people, pushing back against what we have built up over these decades, then we're going to have this very same conversation, because people will just move in and out in different ways. We'll criminalize in different ways. But it's still going to be the same, because at the root, we're going to believe that's the direction we're supposed to go in.
Well, and one of the issues I would mention is a challenge that we face, particularly in the States, is district attorneys, prosecutors, and to a lesser degree, law enforcement. And so trying to get certainly some of them as allies in this effort, and you're people like George Gascon, who's the DA in San Francisco, who's a great supporter of criminal justice reforms, including Proposition 47, but we need more, particularly on the right, leading prosecutors and law enforcement, because the public does look to them for guidance on this. Unfortunately, you know, on issues like civil asset forfeiture, example, they have a financial interest in keeping the money that they seize from people, even who are never convicted of an offense. So, you know, it is challenging to go against that, but we have seen progress in a number of states on that. But I think to some degree in Texas what we've seen is this, the issue of wrongful convictions of people who have been exonerated through DNA and otherwise. That has taken a little bit of the luster off kind of the prosecutors at the legislature and in terms of their image in the public. You know, I think that's interesting. But ultimately, you know, we're a 501c3, so we don't get involved in elections, but certainly there are district attorneys around the country who, if someone who's obstructing reforms were to get knocked off in a primary or otherwise, I mean, that's the kind of thing that could have a ripple effect across the country. So I think that's, you know, kind of a more political strategy than what we're involved in, but it's something that you certainly might see.
Well, I think one of the things around prosecutors, I think, you know, you get in these issues and we love to be dichotomous. We like to put one group here and this and them and bad and good. And the reality is, I think that the intent behind, I think we're all trying to get the same thing. I think we're all trying to get a system. And I really think what I've seen in the states that have the biggest impact is that there's been science or research inserted, and the pivot goes from just desserts, we want to get our punishment, to how can we get an outcome. And you talk about George Gascon, but I could talk about Seth Williams in Philadelphia, who's gotten really creative and research-based, and we've seen crime go down, we've seen violent crime go down, and we've seen less people get sent to state prison from this. So there's an education piece all along, getting the community involved and engaged and understand that they do have a vested interest is important, but I don't think any one group is immune from that approach, where you got to understand what's important and what they're trying to get out of it. And then the education process. And again, the role that academia can play in, I think is very significant. You know, in Pennsylvania's experience, we were fortunate enough to get a National Institute of Justice grant to have an embedded researcher from University of Maryland in our department for 18 months, at the table, at the meetings, in the executive meetings, with access to all the data, access to everything we do. And that really informed us and provided a different perspective around the table, first of all, but also some science that allowed policymakers to be risky and to do things that the research indicates would be effective. And fortunately, we've had positive outcomes, and that's what you build on those successes. But we've, again, the pendulum has swung so far to the point where, you know, the system, as many people come out worse than come out better. So, you know, we got plenty of room to swing back. But understand that every stakeholder group, while it may be the same message, it needs to sound differently, and we need to understand what's important to that group and what the path is to get them to a place that we all want to get to, that we make good decisions that yield better people.
So Nick earlier talked about, and others on the panel, you know, the various dimensions to the problem in terms of racial, spatial, geographic, historical. Do the current policy prescriptions and reform proposals kind of get at all of that, in your estimation, John?
Well, I think it varies state by state, right? And I think that when you hear, you know, not much is going on, I think some states, tremendous things are going on. And again, it's north, south, east, west, all over the place. But I think that the places that are doing the best are taking that broad view. And when you kind of back end or reverse engineer the system and look at who's in. When you see 70% of my population at Pennsylvania Department of Corrections meeting the criteria for addiction and 24% mentally ill, the answer, obviously we need to continue to do good stuff or better stuff inside the prisons, but the answer is what happened to the behavioral health safety net in the community. So when we're devising solutions, we need to devise solutions that work at the front end. I mean, someone who comes to a state prison in Pennsylvania has been arrested, incarcerated between 7 and 8 times. You go, well, then they deserve to be in state prison. I go, why didn't we do something better at the first or second time? Why didn't we ask that follow-up question, identify the root cause, and then, look, if the approach to someone not committing another crime is putting them in treatment, put them in treatment. Put them in treatment and don't give them a record. How about that? So I think that it's taking that broad perspective, and the important part of that is that we're not taking a siloed approach in developing these policies. We have arguments when we're trying to decide this. We have the right and the left. We have prosecutors and advocates at the table, understanding where each is coming from, and just keeping focused on the goal. I mean, again, education, behavioral health, economic opportunities, that's corrections reform. And so the places that will have the best effect, I mean, listen, anybody could change law to save money and release a bunch of people. If we don't change these fundamental things 5 or 10 years from now, we're going to see a balloon effect, and population is going to go right back up, and those mothballed prisons are going to open back up and all that stuff. So it really needs to be that broad view and the multidisciplinary folks working on it.
Yeah, and that's
the same question. Are the proposed solutions adequately addressing those various dimensions?
I'm not sure if they do. I think it depends on the proposals and which specific proposal is being made. And I think that as a national organization, we go all over the place. And I think that what may or may not be appropriate in a place like Vermont that's small, that's relatively small, mostly white and very rural, is going to be very different than what's appropriate for Texas, for example. And I think that's one of the things. I don't think there necessarily is, overall, I don't think there's necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution, but that said, I think there's certain broad brush strokes of things that need to be done. One is the over-criminalization of American life. Is just the fact that every year legislatures are cranking out dozens or hundreds of new crimes. And one example I'll give is just for looking around the room, and I think for the age group of a lot of people, when Prison Legal News started in 1990, Washington was the first state to start sex offender registries and civil commitment. And literally out of whole cloth, a whole new category of crimes was created. Failure to register as a sex offender. And one of the things is, like right now, as we sit here in this room, no one even knows how much it's costing to run all these sex offender registries. No one even knows how many people are locked up for failure to register as a sex offender, for example. This is just one narrow category. I'm not even talking about all the other hundreds of things that have been made illegal in, say, the last 25 years. So I mean, this is the type of stuff that's ballooning up our prison population. And there seems to be a consensus that these sex offender registries actually do nothing towards improving public safety, but they do help create a new permanent underclass of people outside of prison. So I think that's one of the things, is that there's just a lot of things that need to be looked at. And I think one of the things I would say, if you're looking for a quick, simple, I think soundbite is less is better. Less laws, less criminalization, less prison sentences. And I think one of the things I'd like to pick up on what Marc said is the whole issue of parole. Is when we talk about something that could happen to reduce our prison populations today. There was a start back in the 70s. It was the left that pushed for the elimination of parole, where parole policies were widely seen as being racist, as being punitive and counterproductive. And then in the 80s, the right picked up on it and saying, parole, you're letting all these criminals out early and stuff like that. And I think determinant sentencing, my personal opinion is determinant sentencing is the best thing since sliced bread. Just because you sentence people at the outset, you know how much time they're going to do, and if they have the opportunity, and they should have the opportunity to reduce their sentence through positive programming within the prison, but that also assumes that the prison system is going to make that programming available to them. and then they should just get out of prison and that's it. I think that the parole system is one of the biggest wastes of tax dollars. I know probably hundreds, if not thousands, of people that have gotten out on parole over the last 25 years. I've yet to talk to a single person that said, my parole officer helped me fill in the blank, find a job, get treatment, find housing, or whatever. I think it's very much summed up with the tail them, nail them, and jail them, is when you look at the stats on most states around the country, and 25 to 40% of prison admissions are based on parole violations, most of which are technical violations of, hey, I missed an appointment, I left the county, I got married without permission, and stuff like that. You know, this is just a vast jobs program for parole officers. It's not doing anything for public safety, and that's one quick, simple, easy method that could reduce the prison population. And some of this can be done at the executive branch level just by changing the policy on revocations.
Unfortunately, we only have 30 seconds left, and I need Charlene to take us home with what's the one concrete thing we need to do to significantly reduce the size of the prison population?
I think we need to start thinking about mass incarceration as a problem of labor. It's a problem of the economy, not simply a problem of some person committing a crime. Until we get to the point in which we understand that low-skilled, no-skilled workers need to be technically and technologically advanced so that they can engage in the economy, that we need an economy that is built on flourishing people, not just containing them, and that labor is for producing as well as creating spaces for our creative, full capacity development, we will always be in this place.
Paul, Charlene, Marc, John, thank you all.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, we short on time.
So we're going to set up for the second panel.
10-minute break, snacks, come back for the next panel. Thank you.
I think
Nina.
I'm the deputy director, and you know, when you were talking, we have this huge fund that we for movies, it is all about activism. We say this all the time, that it's like a job in this life. Having these opportunities matters so much, and this is our
Young men of color on TV.
about power, organizing ideas, that's exactly what
Okay, so Sean,
Well, you know, that's That's the problem we
Bill just went to the restroom and Shannon was drinking water. So
I'm gonna give you a call. I'm gonna be back in New York in about 2 weeks. I'm gonna give you a call and try to figure out how to have lunch.